Good evening. I hope everything is going well with you. We are continuing in our study of Revelation, and we will be in chapter 6 this evening. Just as a short reminder, the last couple of weeks we have been in Revelation 4 and 5, which have the imagery of God enthroned, surrounded by the elders and all of creation singing in this great cosmic worship. And in chapter 5, we see a very similar kind of imagery where the Lamb is seated on the throne, and we discover the Lamb is the one who is worthy to open the scroll. So when we jump into chapter 6, we are going to learn a little bit about what this scroll is. And although there's a lot of imagery, it's a little bit confusing as to exactly what it's talking about. We'll try to dig in a little bit and at least make a few things clearer. But let's start with chapter 6 this evening. Then I saw the Lamb open one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures call out as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, and there was a white horse, and its rider had a bow. A crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature call out, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people would slaughter one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature call out, "Come." I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider had held a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, but do not damage the olive oil and the wine." When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature call out, "Come." I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. They were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God and for the testimony they had given. They cried out with a loud voice, "Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth?" They were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer, until the number would be complete, both of their fellow servants and of their brothers and sisters, who were soon to be killed as they themselves had been killed. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and there came a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth, and the moon like blood. And the stars of the sky fell to the earth as fig trees drop its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll rolling itself up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand?" And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So in this scene, we have the Lamb who opens the seven seals, and seven again being complete or perfect or whole. So all the seals are opened, and in some sense, this is a full picture, although perhaps not detailed necessarily, but a full picture of God's judgment or the Lamb's judgment upon the world. And what ends up happening is this just sort of an outpouring of death and destruction. Starting with the first seal, there is a horseman that comes out, and it's a white horse that's given a crown to conquer and begins to administer warfare everywhere. And this would have probably been in some way drawing on the imagery of the Parthians, who were great horsemen and would use bows as they were riding. The Romans feared the Parthians and were always worried about an invasion from them, and often would utilize white horses. White was also their kind of color, but there would often be horses that were white horses used as sacred horses, or embodied something that was significant and sacred. And so this may tie to that kind of imagery of horsemen that are utilized in warfare. And in particular, this one, although it doesn't necessarily name the Parthians, this is probably drawing on some of that folklore within the community itself, that warfare, which has always been a part of the Roman life and part of its own sort of empire, and it's how it maintains its own sort of life, is taken on a life much bigger than just the individual, but it's become this cosmic thing where battle warfare is being um, propagated everywhere. And so this becomes kind of the first sign of the Lamb's judgment, that warfare is breaking out. In other words, in some sense, we have been left to our own devices, and our own devices tend to devolve into violence. It's the taking of life and utilization of power. So warfare is, in a sense, a really, it's a very negative thing, but it's seen here as God's judgment. It's seen as the allowance of violence to sort of explode again. And now, if you remember, jumping back to Genesis, the story of Genesis after the fall of Adam and Eve, and the story that goes out from that point is one of violence and increasing violence. And here you get that sense that we've sort of been left to our own devices, and when left to our own devices, we are a very, very violent people, and it becomes quite disruptive. So there's the second seal that comes along, and the horse that comes out is this bright red horse that takes peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another. And there's this great sword, which is a sword of violence and destruction. So again, we see bloodshed, we see the imagery of violence that's sort of escalating and breaking out. Not only in warfare, but also just in the sort of way that life is operating on a personal level. It impacts all of life. Violence is done by nations, it's done by persons, it's done by society. It affects top to bottom. And then there's this third thing that comes out of that, this third horseman, black horseman, that holds a pair of scales. Now, the scales are not justice. Those aren't the scales of justice, trying to mete out justice somehow, but rather the rationing of food. So what comes out of warfare and violence is the skewing of economy, where food becomes scarce and famine can come out of that. That what ends up happening in this story is food. You have to pay for a small amount of food by a day's wages. And so maybe you could think of it as a cup of meal for a day's wages. So you might be able to feed one person, but not much on a day's wages. And so there's just this skewing of the economy where people can't really feed themselves. Now, there is one little bit of hope. Do not damage the olive and the wine. There's a story about Domitian doing something very similar, where he damaged the olive vines and wine vines, the vineyards. And when you do that, you really set the community back several years. It takes a long time for those to develop. You might be able to set back through a famine for a year or so and make it, although it would be very difficult. But to damage the olive and the grapevines really is devastating to a community long term. And so at least there is a little bit of grace in this this kind of judgment. But the reality is of warfare is that famine often comes out of that, and the ability to feed one's family and to feed communities is diminished. And so there's further repercussions of our own propensity towards violence. And then out of that comes the fourth seal, fourth living creature, and this kind of putrid yellow-green horse comes out with death riding it, and Hades, the place of the dead, following it. And they're given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and famine and pestilence and by wild animals of the earth. And so it seems like all of creation has kind of gone crazy. The violence done in creation has impact on the creation, and certainly we can see some of that around us. And then there's this continuation. So we have the sort of outbreak of violence and the devastation of human life and creation as part of that judgment. Now, it's hard to say exactly when this is taking place. Is John talking about that community that is undergoing some of these kinds of realities, which that would have been happening during that time? There was plenty of violence, there was famines, there was earthquakes, there was all sorts of natural disasters that were happening. It would have been really easy to read those and say, well, obviously we're in the throes of God's judgment. This is obviously happening. Um, I think that's a valid way to read this and to see it. But I think you can also begin to see this is kind of the ongoing reality of human life, that God in some ways allows us to be left to our own devices. And when we are, left to our own devices, we become very violent. Not only do we become violent, but it impacts things like our food sources. It impacts the creation. Just even thinking of here in the United States, the overwhelming budget that we have for military impacts things like education for our children. We are struggling to educate our children. We struggle for teachers to have enough resources that would be able to provide education on a level basis for all of our kids in our communities. And when we have invested so deeply in systems of violence and institutions of violence like that, things like development of lands for food become difficult. Not only that, thinking about the world wars that have happened in the last few years and the proliferation of things like nuclear warfare. There is no place in the world that hasn't been impacted by nuclear fallout. It's something that impacts all of creation, and the idea that this has impacted not only those who have been hit directly by these bombs, but those who have been outside of those, blast radii and outside of the blast zones have also been impacted. We are still impacted by that. And it takes a very long time for creation to heal itself. Those places become, in some sense, uninhabitable deserts for a very long time. Thinking of places like Chernobyl, that only now is it really beginning to recover. The radiation levels are low enough that with protection you can go into those areas, but it's taken a very long time to even come to that place where you can go in with some kind of protection. So the ripple effect of our violence continues to play itself out. Not to mention just the devastating loss of life that happens in warfare, not only to those that are combatants, but to families, to children, and to generations that are dealing with the loss of life of loved ones. And so this vision goes on, and in verse 9, there's a fifth seal that is opened, and under the altar are the souls of those who have been slaughtered for the word of God and for the testimony they had given. And they cry out with this loud voice, lamentation, sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth? So not only is there great warfare and strife in the world, but here, present day, are those who have died because of their testimony, died because of their faith. Now, this is real persecution. We often have a kind of persecution complex in the United States when we imagine that our lives are being persecuted, and it's really just an inconvenience. And there's a significant difference for these who have testified to the life of Jesus and the life of the church and being part of that. Their life would have been very difficult. They would have been excluded from things like trade. They would have been excluded from being part of the community in the same kinds of ways that other citizens might. And they find themselves on the outskirts being marginalized and finding it difficult. But beyond that, if there were certain times where persecution would rise up in those communities and they would be blamed, scapegoated for disrupting the economy or challenging the way that the communities structured their life against those that were most vulnerable. And so they often spoke out against the politics of the day and were often arrested and sometimes killed for their speaking out. And here they are underneath the altar, which the altar is a place of communion with God and humanity. It's the place where the sacrifice of blood would have happened. So, in some sense, their lives have been a sacrifice. It's a reminder that standing before God or before the altar of God, here they are crying out. Their blood cries out, kind of like Abel's blood cries out to God for God to act and to make things right, to act on the side of justice against those who have perpetrated violence and used power against them. And so they're each given a white robe, which is a sense of purity, of being cleansed, of being right before God. And they're told to rest a little longer until this would be completed. Which gives a sense that this is an ongoing reality for the church then, and in some places still an ongoing reality for the church as well today. And so the sixth seal is then opened, and out of that comes this great earthquake. The sun becomes like black sackcloth, which sackcloth would have been a garment of mourning. And the moon becomes like blood. The stars start to fall from the sky like fig trees drop their leaves in the winter. And the sky vanished like a scroll rolling itself up. And every mountain and island was removed from its place. And so in this last kind of imagery, you have sort of the erasure of everything. There's black skies. There's bloody moons. There's really just powerful imagery. Not that this is going to be the exact thing that happens, but what he's communicating through this imagery is that everything's sort of falling apart in the creation. Everything that is, so steady, we believe, everything that we believe is, in some sense, there and permanent, is done away with. It falls away, and the earthquake becomes this great leveler. In some sense, the mountains and the valleys and all those kinds of things become imagery for creation and for humanity as well. That which is high is brought low, that which is low is brought up. There is this sort of leveling that happens and an erasure of that. And the sky vanishes, so creation kind of undoes itself. And then, but it's not the kind of undoing that apparently humanity is gone or wiped out. Here in verse 15, it says the kings of the earth, the magnates, which are you could say the business people, the generals, the rich, the powerful, and everyone. All of a sudden, they're kind of tagged on at the end, the slave and the free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And so naming the powerful people, the business people, the magnates, the kings, the generals, those who are leaders of warfare, the rich, the powerful. So it names those five kinds of groups. And then it kind of tags, those who are impoverished as well, the slave. But there's this sense of judgment, impending judgment, especially on those who are rich and powerful and who've used that power and those riches for their own gain and against those who are impoverished. Their power holds nothing. Their power has limitations. Their power cannot right everything here. It can't fix everything. And ultimately, their riches and their power don't mean anything. And so they call on the mountains and rocks to fall on them, to hide them, so that they can escape the sight of God, much like Adam and Eve in the garden. Once they knew they had failed, once they knew they had sinned against God, they go and hide. And this has been the ongoing reality of humanity, that when confronted with the reality of God, we often will hide. We cannot bear that gaze. We cannot bear the holiness of God. And we recognize there is this distinct difference in God's holiness and our own sense of righteousness. And so They recognize in all these things happening in the great tumult of the world that this is God's judgment, and ultimately that they are being held responsible for their actions. Now, again, is John talking about at that moment or in a future date? It's hard to say. We don't know. But we can see in some reality these kinds of things as ongoing realities in the life of humanity. Warfare is an ongoing reality. Death and famine and the sort of undoing of creation, ongoing realities. And there is this deep need to recognize that God's judgment isn't about revenge here. It's about righting everything that has been wrong. It's about, in some sense, saying, okay, have your way. If you're going to sort of live apart from God, live apart from what I've called you to be and to do as part of this creation, there's great consequence to that. And what ends up happening is the unraveling of creation. And in many ways, we continue to see those realities worked out in our lives, in our day, and it's this ongoing need for repentance. I think that judgment is really a call for, to recognize the ways that we are breaking down creation, the ways that we are living apart from God, living in contestation and violence, living in the refusal to recognize that God is the creator and we are not. And so we continue to try to grab as much as we can and to fight over it and to utilize our power for our own sake rather than for the sake of God's creation or for others. And when that happens, judgment comes out of the natural life that naturally comes out of that. Judgment begins to show in the ways that we live our lives as there's this unraveling of life. You will see quite often those who have been quite rich and famous and who have used people will find themselves unraveling. They will find themselves living isolated. They will find themselves living in ways that are destructive because they can't find a sense of peace, of hope, of joy. And what ends up coming out of that is a bunch of destruction and death. And even on a larger scale, when nations live this way, what comes out of that is judgment as well. And it impacts everybody. It tears down community, it tears down the creation, and ultimately, what ends up happening is death and destruction. I think in this passage, though, even though it's a heavy passage and in some ways maybe even kind of a fearful passage, I think it's helpful to recognize that it's the crucified Lamb who has come and been with us in the midst of the devastation of life, in the midst of the brokenness of creation. And so this is about the restoration of things. This is about making right. This is about putting things right. And although judgment is painful and frightening, we can trust that the one who is doing that judgment as the crucified lamb, the slain lamb, is one who does not operate in quite the same ways that we do. And so even in judgment, we can find grace. Well, I hope this was helpful. I look forward to jumping into chapter 7 next week with you. May God bless you and keep you.